Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Jacob Levy, the coordinator of the research group on constitutional studies, and this is the second in this year's RGCS Lecture Series. We begin by acknowledging that McGill University is on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. The research group on constitutional studies brings together scholars from across McGill and in particular from political science, philosophy, and law to study the values, institutions, and principles that constitute and form the basic governing rules of societies around the world, from approaches that are normative, historical, interpretive, empirical, and juridical. That multidisciplinary and multi-methodological approach reaches from our faculty group that meets together through our PhD fellowship and to the undergraduate and master's student fellowship, whose members are all here with us today, and extends, in addition, to the speakers we invite for the RGCS Lecture Series. The lecture series is oriented around the conviction that we can bring excellent researchers in that range of fields, philosophy, law, and the social sciences, and normative social inquiry. We can bring excellent researchers to McGill and have them present their research in ways that are broadly accessible to an advanced student audience, overcoming traditional distinctions between the presentation of research and the kind of teaching work that often is kept confined within one's own institution. It is our great pleasure today to welcome to the RGCS Lecture Series Jonathan Rodden. Jonathan Rodden is professor of political science, a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and serves also as director of the Spatial Social Science Lab at Stanford. He holds a PhD from Yale University, and his honors include having been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the Center for the Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and a Fulbright Scholar. He is the co-editor of the books Decentralized Governance and Accountability, and of Fiscal Decentralization and the Challenge of Hard Budget Constraints. He's the author, most recently, of the influential book Why Cities Lose: The Deep Roots of the Urban-Rural Divide, and is the author also of Hamilton's Paradox: The Promise and Peril of Fiscal Federalism, which won the Gregory Lubert Award for the best book in comparative politics when it was first published, and just last year was honored with the Martha Durthik Award for a lasting contribution to the study of federalism. The awards committee for the Durthik Award wrote, "Jonathan Rodden's Hamilton's Paradox stands out as an analytical tour de force that shines a light on the political economy of fiscal discipline in a federation. Blending insights from comparative politics, game theory, and modern macroeconomics, Rodden explores how political incentives play out in multi-level institutions of governance. Hamilton's Paradox achieves subtlety and breadth by combining econometrics with rich treatments of complex historical cases, first in the US, then Germany and Brazil, and finally across a diverse range of other countries. It is already a classic of the field and will likely remain one for many years to come." Signed by the committee, Katrina Kosick, Jean-Paul Fauguet, and Jacob Levy. That account gives, I think, a summary of the range of approaches, subjects, and types of inquiry that Jonathan Rodden has brought to his studies of federalism, decentralization, and political geography over the course of his career. It is multi-methodological and rigorous in each of the methods that it uses, and we are very privileged to have him with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Rodden.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really looking forward to I hope getting through my talk in an amount of time that allows me to also learn some things from all of you. One of the things you will discover, hopefully kind of early on in this talk, that I'm the rare American who's really fascinated with Canadian politics. And I had, so this, I'm talking, this is a project that I was first invited to come and speak about right at the beginning of the pandemic, at which point I had just published a book called Why Cities Lose: The Deep Roots of the Urban-Rural Political Divide. And that was a book that started out as an academic kind of university press type of book. And in that book, there was to be an entire chapter on Canada and a chapter on the UK and a chapter on Australia. At some point, I was convinced to turn that book into a more of a kind of a popular book for a broader audience, and it's already a really long book with a lot of figures and charts. And so the editor convinced me that all of the parliamentary systems should go into one chapter, and the Canadian chapter got lost. And so, but I would like to try out some of the materials from that today on you. It'll be a much broader talk than that, but there's some interesting interesting issues in this book that I think this is a great audience for me to also learn from. Jacob asked me if I would speak, even though this book is really, it touches on federalism here and there, if I would say a little bit about how I got from thinking about writing Hamilton's Paradox and thinking about federalism to thinking about political geography, and it was a rather natural transition. So I'm going to kind of start and end this lecture by thinking a little bit about this question. A basic challenge to constitutional design is that political preferences, the things people want from government, are often clustered in space. They're often geographically arranged in specific ways. And so you can end up with local geographic clusters where people have strong preferences, but they end up being consistently overwhelmed by a majority in the rest of the polity. And so you can think about a place where people have, for instance, specific preferences about language policy, or you can think about differences in preferences about redistribution, schooling, and so forth that are arranged in geographic space. And so you can end up with a group that's kind of in these small clusters being overwhelmed by the larger majority. And you can think about groups that are, perhaps if they're evenly sized, then you can have democratic politics that turns into this geographically polarized battle between those groups. And we can think about various countries in which two groups that are kind of geographically clustered end up doing battle in ways that harm the stability of the polity of democracy. So an obvious solution, of course, to this kind of arrangement is a federal structure, or within that federal structure, some system of decentralization in which these smaller groups can choose their own policies. And this, of course, is the solution that has been used in the United States and Canada from their founding, and it's something I've thought a lot about and written a lot about. But it's not this doesn't solve every problem, and there are a lot of issues that still remain unresolved. I've studied a lot the history of centralization of fiscal and political and administrative authority over time, and every time there is a war or a pandemic or a recession, we end up with these big spikes in the role of higher level governments, and there ends up being kind of a ratchet effect where those never really quite go away. Canada is a place where they do actually return to form a little bit more quickly, a little bit more completely than other places, but even in Canada we see a slow growth of centralization over time. But a bigger problem perhaps for this question is that the structure of jurisdictions often doesn't really match up with these clusters of distinctive preferences. So we can think about lots of places where this is true, and I'll come back to this at the end. But another problem is just that there are externalities of policies across jurisdictional boundaries. So it's fine for Chicago to try to regulate firearms sales. But if it's possible to just go from Chicago to Gary, Indiana and make weapons purchases, then that kind of regulation at the city level doesn't work very well. We could say that America is hopelessly divided about abortion policy, and that division isn't really one between states. It's one that happens within states between urban areas and rural areas, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But a solution to that, just to sort of let municipalities set their own abortion policy, probably doesn't work very well, given the ability to move around. And even at the state level, there's a lot of interesting issues in American federalism that will now have to be determined in a situation where it's possible perhaps to travel across jurisdictional boundaries to get services that are illegal in other places. So we can't just make this problem go away with decentralization. So in societies where we can't do that, we can end up with some problems in democratic representation associated with the clustering of preferences. And so this is broadly construed. This is kind of what the field of political geography is about. You've got some democracy, some group that needs to make some collective decision, and you have these clusters of preferences, and you have some decision rule for how to aggregate those preferences into policies. And in places like the United States and Canada, Australia, that were colonized by Great Britain, we have a very particular set of rules involving small winner-take-all, majoritarian, single-member districts, which really structure the game in a way that it matters. So I'm going to be spending my time today talking about how that game is structured and how the imposition of these winner-take-all districts onto a distinctive geography of preferences that has emerged over the last 30 or 40 years really even goes back further than that. I'm going to walk through some of the issues associated with that. So just to give you a sense of what I'm starting with, I just want to start with a dot density map of political outcomes that kind of intentionally doesn't have any borders or city names on it. So if you look at it for a moment, hopefully you start to get your bearings and understand where we are. But these red dots in the United States, kind of throwing on its head the usual red-blue structure in the US. Red is votes for Democrats, and blue is votes for Republicans. And in Canada, red is votes for either the NDP or the Liberals. And this is from, I think, the 2012 election in the US and 2011 in Canada. And blue is votes for the Conservatives. And so if hopefully you've kind of figured out by now that we've got Cleveland, we have Detroit, we can go over and look at Buffalo and Rochester. But then we come around and we cross the border and we're in Southern Ontario, in Metro Toronto, and up here Ottawa, and up in the very top, Montreal. And so a similar arrangement. And this is a map that I made. I think initially I was giving a talk on the structure, on the kind of concentration of democratic support in American cities, and I was told, well, this is really a function of slavery and race and housing policy and sort of the concentration of low-income minorities in American city centers. And so I guess this map is in a way sort of my answer to that question. Is it the exact same phenomenon? We really, I'll show you this clearly in a few minutes. The same structure, the kind of the relationship between distance from the city center and voting behavior is very similar in these two countries. So I want to ask you first, I want to talk about what explains this, and I'll start off with something that really I worked on for a long time, which is the kind of the deep historical roots of this in the Industrial Revolution. But after a lot of work on that, I've come around to the view that really much of what we might care about in the urban-rural divide, understanding differences between places in terms of voting behavior according to population density, owes to some things that have happened well after the Industrial Revolution, things that have happened since the 1980s, even the 1970s, relating to the rise of a set of non-economic issues in our politics. But also I'll talk about globalization and the rise of the knowledge economy a bit. But I'd like to move somewhat quickly through these deeper questions about where this comes from and kind of recognize this as a fact, and maybe we can argue a bit about where it comes from, and there's still a lot of research to be done about that, I think. But I want to then talk about the implications for representation and for political polarization. So this book that I was initially invited to speak about is largely about representation. I've been thinking a lot since then about political polarization, the role of geography in shaping this kind of phenomenon of political polarization, in particular affective polarization, the kind of the view that the out party is someone who people actually have hostile and negative affect for. This is something that I think is also not unrelated to geography and the way the institutions interact with the geography. So I'd like to talk a bit about that. So I'll spend a lot of my time talking about the United States, but then I will also talk about how this works out differently in some parliamentary systems, and I'd like to say quite a bit about Canada if you will indulge me and maybe tell me the ways in which I get it wrong. That would be a great service to me. I would really appreciate that. But I will start in the U.S. and I will start in Pennsylvania. a state that I've been interested in for a while. And just going to look these. It's probably hard for you to see, but that's okay. These are just graphs of population density on the x-axis and of Democratic share of the vote in presidential elections on the y-axis, and the observations are counties in the state of Pennsylvania. And so in 1916, there was actually a negative relationship. So the Democrats did a little bit better in more rural places and sparsely populated places. And the cities in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh were actually controlled by Republican machines. So machine politics was a Republican thing in urban Pennsylvania, even though it was a Democratic thing in New York and Boston. That's kind of how US politics was in this period. But for a while, this relationship was negative. But then in 1928, the nomination for the U.S. presidency goes to Al Smith, who is a Catholic Irish candidate from New York, who had been cultivating an urban constituency in New York politics, and then that sort of suddenly shows up more broadly. And so we see the emergence of this positive correlation between population density and Democratic voting, and we see that increasing over time and then kind of stabilizing in the 1930s after the New Deal and the kind of the rise of, so the Democrats eventually start to mobilize urban workers in cities and become the party of urban workers, and you see this correlation kind of stabilize. And so a lot of what I was initially interested in this project was understanding the kind of the roots of this in Britain and in Europe and other places in the Industrial Revolution. But of course, class is declining as a determinant, something that drives politics in these countries, and other issues. Around Engelhardt and others have written about the rise of other issues in these countries, and we see something really dramatic happen in the U.S. since the 1980s, really since the Reagan era, where these slopes start to get steeper and steeper. To 2016, and if I added 2020, it would even be a little steeper, that the correlation between population density and democratic voting is extremely high. And it's almost like if anybody here in the social sciences just spends time making scatter plots, they don't usually come out like that. It's a really stunning relationship. And so I think that's a great puzzle. And I just want to say a little bit more. Counties can be kind of deceptive as units of analysis. This is just looking at a place like this is the cities of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre in Pennsylvania, and this is back from the 2016 election. But you see the kind of concentration of Democratic voting in these cities. This is precinct level data. You can zoom out and look at the larger this part of Pennsylvania. I don't know how well this shows up, but one of the things that's just kind of fascinating to look at is that there are the 19th century rail lines that connect the factories of the early 20th century. That there's a kind of purple and blue veins kind of running along those rail lines, and canals and rivers as well. Transport networks where factories were built. And you can even see kind of in the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre corridor, these are seams of coal in the ground. This is where the Democrats became powerful earlier in the century. And we can even see, if we just pan a little bit to the west, you can see kind of along the river between Pittsburgh, Youngstown, and Cleveland, and along these kind of 19th century rail networks, you have these concentrations of support for the party of the left. One of the things I think is interesting about this is the relationship is fractal in the sense that even if we go from the counties down to the level of the precincts, so now I'm going to look within those counties that you saw, the units that were the dots in that previous graph. Now the dots are going to be precincts within those. And even here we see that even in a kind of a rural place out in the middle of Pennsylvania, as you go from the farm fields to maybe the county seat where there is a courthouse, and there are some in many cases, some unionized public workers. There might be some rental housing around the town square. The Democratic vote share goes up even at these low levels. So there's this relationship that seems to reappear at lots of different levels of analysis. And I've been working to collect data from other countries, and this is a fairly common thing we see in different settings. And so this is just a little something from the book. I have a long kind of discussion of this town in Pennsylvania, Reading. as an example, just looking at the rail network and kind of looking at the Democratic vote share and the way it concentrates near these old 19th century rail hubs. And all kinds of things happen, of course, since the 19th century. This is the place where eventually Lowell University was built, and so you've got your college professor contingent that's part of this story. But you also see places that have ended up with, where the factories are long gone. And many of these factories, if you look at a place like Pennsylvania, many of these factories were really only there, and the industrial working class was only there for 20 or 30 years. And then the places, the factories, this was textiles, a lot of it in this town. A lot of it moved to the south very quickly as unions started to form and wage demands were made. And very quickly, this textile manufacturing moved to the south, and it was there for a while, and then it moved to Mexico and other places. But this legacy remains. All of this working class housing was built in these places, and that working class housing continues to attract relatively poor people. It attracts minorities, and it also attracts renters, young people. A lot of different things are kind of embedded in that built environment that continue to shape politics today. And so just seeing, you can just kind of graph some of this. I've had a lot of fun playing around with the railroad data and looking at vote shares, and it's really the case that when the closer you are to a 19th century rail node, that's what we're looking at here on the x-axis. The higher is the Democratic vote share in some of these, especially in some of these industrialized states. And so another thing that is I find interesting is that you can go into the nice thing about counties as units of analysis in the U.S. is they don't change that much over time. You can go back in history and still follow the counties. One of the things we see is that there's a good predictor of Democratic vote share today is actually having a lot of manufacturing in 1920. But having a lot of manufacturing today actually is the opposite relationship. So places where manufacturing has held on, the Republicans have realigned and slowly become the party of manufacturing, the party that really pushes for the maintenance of manufacturing in the US, whereas the places where manufacturing has come and long gone are still the places where the Democrats are powerful. Now that's a kind of a fascinating story, but it can only explain so much. Left voting is especially strong in wealthy city centers without strong remnants of working class politics, and of course the same thing is true in places like Vancouver, and the same thing is true here in the provincial. in the federal riding that we're sitting in. So left voting there's got to be more to it than this old class cleavage, and in fact the class cleavage of the Industrial Revolution has faded. So this is just a graph that takes, if you just remember those Pennsylvania graphs and you think about the slope of that line, the thing that I'm graphing here is the slope of the line. So how strong is the relationship between density and Democratic voting? And I look and see that it varies by region. It really emerged first in the US in the manufacturing core of the Northeast, but then it eventually shows up in some of the other non-southern states. Initially, in the south of the U.S., the Democrats are the party of rural segregationists, and so the Democrats are actually a more rural party in the south. But there's this slow convergence, and then the thing that I think is really worth trying to understand is that these things really converge over time to where the relationship between density and Democratic voting is the same everywhere in the U.S. now. In the south, the Northeast, Idaho, it doesn't matter. It's very similar in all these places, and it's become much more pronounced than it used to be. So these parties of the left have really changed. And that's something that really took me a long time to try to come to grips with, but I think that's what happened. And I tell a story in the book about how new urban interest groups emerge, race, social issues, and others are added to the mix, and they convince the parties in cities to take up a new set of issues. So there's also the changing geography of manufacturing and the rise of the knowledge economy that I'll talk a little bit about. We used to have these agglomeration economies in cities where it made sense to build lots of factories close to each other in a place like Reading or in the network of cities around Philadelphia. And now it makes sense for a lot of knowledge economy production to take place in these dense corridors like the one near Silicon Valley or in Seattle or in Boston or Toronto or Vancouver for that matter. So that's a little bit something. So we can go in the surveys and we can just ask a lot of questions about economic and social issues. I'll just walk you through very quickly what this is about. We have some surveys that ask a lot of the same questions over time in the US. So there's one called the General Social Survey. I could take a bunch of economic issues questions and take essentially an average of people's preferences on those issues. Get you a sense of where each respondent is on a big left-right scale. And I know where people live. And so I can see that on economic issues, over time, there's still been this kind of, if we look here, like this is the major city core, and this is rural counties up here, or small or non-metro counties with a large town. There's a big gap that's been pretty substantial and pretty stable on the economic dimension. On moral questions related to abortion, gay marriage, the role of religion in society, gender, a set of questions like that I make an issue scale out of. There's also a really big difference, a big gap. I mean, everybody has moved a little bit to the left on things like gay marriage, but the gap between urban and rural places has really remained. But I think the thing that's changed in US politics is that this stuff was not part of politics, really. It wasn't part of the political divide. If it was part of politics, it was at the candidate level. It didn't map onto the national parties until something like around the era of Ronald Reagan, when the Republican Party really started to latch on to rural, socially conservative voters, religious voters. And that really changed things. And so this is, again, a graph that is a little complicated, but I can quickly talk you through it. Again, we're taking those economic issues and those moral issues, and we're just trying to figure out what is the best way of seeing where the difference is between people who vote for Democrats and vote for Republicans in the survey, people who report voting for these different parties. And this is just trying to find the best separating line between people on these two dimensions, between people who call themselves Democrats and Republicans. And what you see is that the line is in the 70s and in the early 80s is basically just economics that is dividing people. But over time, it becomes more and more diagonal, meaning that this moral issue is getting better and better at kind of arranging people into parties. And what's interesting about that is that people's preferences on that moral values dimension, as you saw in that previous graph, are highly correlated with population density. So people who are morally conservative are much more likely to live in less dense areas. And just some other things that have also happened during the same time, the rise of the knowledge economy happens in urban places. The phenomenon of college-educated people working jobs in technology, there's really no reason initially why they should necessarily be connected to the Democratic Party. I mean, you can see that in the 1970s, this is county-level data on college attainment and voting. In the 70s and earlier, it was the fact that the places that had more educated people were more Republican. But over time, something changes as the knowledge economy cities start to become affiliated with the Democratic Party. And that's still a big story that is, I think, not fully told. There's a lot to still try to understand about that. How it came to be, again, I would tell the story where the party of the left is already the party of cities. And just as with race or with social issues and other things, they respond to the coalitions that they've already built in these cities. And when new issues emerge, so when Boston transitions from being an industrial town to a place where Harvard and MIT are getting grants from the federal government and building defense industry stuff, and they're trying to get H-1B visas for foreign workers to come, and they have a distinctive set of issues, the only game in town really is the Democratic Party in Boston. And so they start forging relationships with the Democratic Party. So I think similar things happen in San Francisco and Seattle. And the Democrats start to become the party of the knowledge economy. And so we see with patents as well. Like all of a sudden there's this relationship between patents and county level patenting behavior and voting. And this is just a measure of knowledge economy employment itself that I put together. So there's something going on there, and I think there's something similar happening in Canada. And London, Melbourne, Sydney, this is something that happens in a lot of places. So these parties that started out as working class parties, responding to the needs of urban workers early in the 20th century, over time become these diverse coalitions of people who live in the houses that were built for the workers in the early 20th century, poor service workers, minorities, students, but also in some places very well compensated professionals. Left parties become essentially just catch-all urban coalitions. And so this is some work that is really, I think, is not published yet, that is just put together by some people who have been looking at this in Canada. This was a paper that was just presented at the American Political Science Association a few weeks ago. I won't talk you through the methodology they're using here, but this is their kind of way of trying to capture the urban-rural divide over time. And so this graph starts in 1920 for each country. They have Britain, the US, and Canada. And so this story I'm telling you about the US, where it really starts in the New Deal and then takes off more recently and to new heights, it's a little different in Canada. By this technique, you don't really see, there are little kind of spikes of urban-rural conflict in Canada in the past, but it really doesn't start to take off until the same era, 80s, 90s. But then the big spike has been more recent. So it's been a little bit more late to arrive in Canada, but certainly this increasing correlation between density and voting behavior is happening in Canada as well. Okay, so what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about is once this happens, that's an interesting story. There's lots to still understand about it. What are the implications of this concentration of voters for parties of the left in city centers? So I'll talk a bit about the United States, and I will try to convince you briefly that it is difficult for the Democrats to translate their votes into seats because of the way they are distributed in space. But I also want to tell you that I think one of the most interesting things about this is the way it creates divisions within the parties, and especially the Democratic Party, between the urban core of the party in the districts in the big cities and the actual pivotal districts in the middle of the distribution, which are largely suburban and mixed districts. Those are the ones the party needs to win in order to form legislative majorities. And there's a lot of interesting things that happen in that tension. And so we end up with these heterogeneous divided parties. And if I have enough time, I will try to convince you that this is actually, strangely, this is a big part of why effective polarization is growing in the United States. That that is actually part of the divides within the parties that are themselves partly a function of geography is what creates a lot of the discord in the American party system. In Canada, I'm very interested in this long-lasting liberal NDP partisan split on the left. I think a lot of the things that in the US create tension within the Democratic Party in Canada end up being manifest as a semi-permanent divide between the NDP and the Liberals. At least that's one story that I'm interested in exploring. But also I want to talk a little bit about tensions within the Liberal Party and some of the things that are perhaps more similar to the US. But it also leads to very interesting coordination problem, of course, between the NDP and the Liberals, especially in some of the urban and some suburban districts. And in a perennial battle over electoral reform that maybe if we have time to say a little bit about that, we can. Because one of the, people on the left who read my book in the US have one of two reactions. If they're the moderates who read it say, see, this is why we need to make the urban extremists just be quiet because they're creating a problem for us. And the people on the left have now they want me to come to speak about the glories of proportional representation, and so so in Canada as well. If, in case I run out of time, obviously there is this goes back to the beginning of, but it does go back to the Industrial Revolution. Labor parties and liberal parties trying to run in the same districts and running into coordination problems. Each one hoping to be the mainstream party, the left. The liberals seeing themselves in that way and not really being very interested in proportional representation, right up to the point when they believe they're being squeezed out by the NDP, and then they change their mind, but then they change it back again in a way that I think is really fascinating. But so just how does this happen? How does it turn out? So a correlation between density and left voting doesn't really need to be have implications for representation. I want to try to show you why I think it does. So I'm going to show you some graphs, and I'll get to some in Canada in a minute, where the origin of the graph is actually City Hall in Pittsburgh. And so just think about these are precincts in Pennsylvania. And so every precinct, I'm just measuring the distance between the centroid of that precinct and every other precinct in Pennsylvania. So this is just the distance of every precinct in Pennsylvania from City Hall in Pittsburgh. And so you're kind of moving out in a couple different directions, but you're mostly moving west to east as you do this. And so this is the Republican vote share on the y-axis. And so what you see is out in the rural periphery of Pennsylvania, it's pretty Republican. But every time you get to a city, you have these kind of stalactites that go through the suburbs where it's sort of mixed, and then you get to the city center where it's overwhelmingly Democratic. And so you get to downtown Philadelphia, and there are precincts where there are really literally no Republican votes. And so every election, I get journalists calling me and saying, surely this is proof of election fraud. Like, surely there couldn't be a precinct where there are no Republicans, but there are such precincts. And they're not very big. Some of these places have lost population and so forth. But this is how American political geography kind of works. And so the point is that when you're drawing districts, you're kind of taking some of these dots and you're putting them together, and you can't just randomly take some of these and put them together. You have to, if you're drawing compact, contiguous districts, you're going to end up with some very Democratic Philadelphia districts and some very Democratic Pittsburgh districts. And it gets interesting then when you're districting the state legislature versus the US Congress, and because the scale matters and the size of these city matters. But the basic idea is that you get these concentrations. You never get districts in the rural places that are nearly as Republican as these Democratic districts are Democratic in the cities. In part because you're coming along through a place like this, and State College, very Democratic place where Penn State is located, gets combined with all of its rural periphery into a Republican district. So it won't be an overwhelmingly Republican district, but it'll be a safe Republican district. So some version of that happens all throughout the country. And so this is just turning these things, like zooming in on urban areas and just making, again, a graph that this is the distance from the city center, from City Hall, and this is the Trump vote share in 2016. And you can see it goes up in a similar kind of function in each city. Now, one of the things I'm interested in that I won't have time to talk about today is this really does vary a lot from one place to another, depending on urban form, urban design, and all kinds of interesting things like that. So if anyone's ever been to Phoenix, Arizona, it is a place that just doesn't have a 19th century core. It's a place that emerged in the era of the automobile. It's just a big sprawling thing. And it's actually much more of a political patchwork. This relationship is not nearly as steep in a place like Phoenix. It's not nearly as steep in Orlando. So some of the newer cities that are growing are a little less this way than some of these old 19th century cities. And something similar is true in Australia. These graphs look a lot less, they're a lot less steep in Australia, which is also a very suburbanized, car-oriented place. But the story in a place like Pennsylvania is that when you start drawing electoral districts, you end up with a distribution of the Trump vote share across districts that has a big left skew. So I know Jacob said that this is supposed to be a lecture series in which we don't go too far into social science kind of detail. So if there's anything that doesn't make sense, please speak up and feel free to interrupt. But basically, it's just a histogram of the vote share. It has a big left tail. And so that means that these are the urban districts that are extremely Democratic. And then these are the districts that the Republicans win. And so this is not an efficient distribution of support. The Democrats are wasting a lot of their votes in the tail of the distribution. Now, so this is something that Americans, they see this and they say, aha, well, Pennsylvania is notoriously gerrymandered. So we know that this is just driven by gerrymandering by politicians. So that is a problem, and that's why early in this project I was more interested in studying Canada and the UK, at places where the districts are actually drawn by competent professionals and not by politicians. So kind of to make the US more like Canada, I started messing around with computer simulations and started to say, well, what would it look like if the districts were not drawn by partisans? What if I design a computer algorithm that draws the districts? So I spent a lot of time and effort working with folks on these algorithms, and we've ended up using them a lot in the court cases related to gerrymandering. But just to show you what that looks like, I mean, part of the story here is that when you just let the computer draw the districts, you still get these big left skew in the distribution. So there's something about the geography that is hard to get around, where you end up with these very Democratic seats out in the tail of the distribution. So a graph that I think is to me is just kind of stunning. I think it's buried in a book that has 50 graphs. So so it's not one that I've heard that many people outside of Pennsylvania talk about. But this is like from World War II to the present. This is the Senate of Pennsylvania, and this is a place that is it's essentially a Democratic state. I mean, it's a blue-ish state, maybe a purple state. But lots of lots of Democratic governors and lots of Democratic senators and so forth throughout this period. But what we have here in black for the state senate is just the overall vote share. It's a little bit complicated because you have some non-competitive districts, and so it's kind of hard to just add up these votes. But you see it's kind of close to 50-50. It's kind of bouncing around. But the seat share is something different. So almost the entire post-war period has had a comfortable Republican majority in the Senate, with just a couple of exceptions. And there are plenty of times during this process that the districts were not drawn by partisan Republicans. There were some times through here when they were. But the gerrymandering is not the full story. It's a very important story. I'm not going to deny that, but it's we Americans kind of move too quickly to that conclusion that it is the story. That's part of why I think it's useful to compare it with some other cases. So okay, I want to spend a little bit of time kind of pondering this graph. So I showed you. You're going to see. You've been seeing about a bunch of distributions that have this left skew. So you saw earlier a distribution of vote shares for Republican candidates in statewide elections or in national elections in Pennsylvania. What I'm looking at now is this is a distribution of something else. We've gone into surveys. Remember I told you about those creating issue scales based on lots of different questions. Here we're doing the same thing, trying to figure out what is the ideology of a district. How can we characterize from the surveys the ideology of a district? This is something we've spent a lot of time trying to come up with good ways statistically to achieve that, and I think we've got something pretty good. And this is what it looks like. So this is the distribution on a left-right scale, a bunch of questions, putting all the economic and the social stuff all into one big soup and just asking, all right, how liberal or conservative is a person? And then how liberal or conservative is a district? This is what the distribution looks like. So you've got this big left tail again, and these are the urban districts. This is the Bronx, this is Detroit, this is the Bay Area districts in California. And so what that means is that in our survey, the median voter in the survey is here, but the median district is here. And so if you're trying to win the legislature, you shouldn't care about the median voter in the district. You should care about the median voter in the median district, which is way over here. And so part of the problem, I think, one of the central problem of democracy in majoritarian systems in the era of urban-rural conflict is that there is a big distance between these people and these people. Mm-hmm. There's a big ideological gap there. And there's a much smaller gap over here. So the most right-wing rural district is not that far from the median kind of ex-urban suburban district, whereas the urban districts are really far from. And so this is kind of the divide that the Democrats have to traverse, and it's not easy. And so I was presenting something like this during the pandemic on Zoom at Western, and so some people who were listening thought it would be cool to do something similar in Canada, and so I've been in touch with them, and so this is something that Jack Lucas at the University of Calgary has just sent me, and so he did the same thing. He used the same technique that I described to you to try to figure out what is the ideology of each federal parliamentary constituency. And we see a left skew, not nearly as pronounced as in the U.S., but we still see something kind of similar. And so this, I believe, is this where we are? Yes. Okay, I thought that was my mapping skills are okay. And this is where the Prime Minister's riding, you can kind of see again the median riding is to the right of the median voter. So you have something like the same dynamic in Canada, and so this is something that I'd like to try to understand. I think this is something we're going to see in a lot of majoritarian systems where the parties of the left have to kind of contend with this broader spread. And in Canada, so you have this thing that is somewhat unique, which is that ever since the rise of the CCF, you've had this divide on the left between what has become, over time, the CCF went from being this prairie populist party into being a kind of an urban, working class social democratic party. But then it still has these outposts that I'm always trying to understand, these Northern Ontario liberal strongholds, which seem to be some combination of, Daniel and I were talking about this earlier, some combination of mining and but there's this divide on the left between the NDP and the Liberals, and in some cities it seems to be that the city center is, the NDP, should be most competitive in these places, and it often is. But then there's this coordination problem that people have to resolve. So if anybody here is kind of someone who votes for the left in some place in urban Canada here, or some place back where they grew up, it seems to me that in every election you kind of have to figure out not just whether the NDP or the Liberal is the most credible alternative in the country, but also in your particular constituency. And that's a hard thing to necessarily have good information about. But this is something that to me is kind of interesting, and I see similar things in other places. I know I'm showing you a lot of distributions. I have to make sure I explain to you exactly what this is. So now I'm going into a survey, and people are asked to place themselves on an 11-point scale, so from 0 to 10. What is your ideology on the left-right dimension, a single left-right dimension? What are you? And so what I'm seeing here, and I'm just plotting what people say, who also say that they vote for these different parties. So people who say they vote for the Liberals are very moderate. I mean, they're much more. They're like a 4 on average, like a 4.5 or something. But look, this is the midpoint. A big chunk of the Liberal Party is people who call themselves conservatives. Like the tail goes way over. There are people who say that they're very conservative and they vote for the Liberal Party. And by the way, the same thing is true of the Democrats. There are a lot of people who call themselves conservatives who still vote for Democrats. It's not symmetrical. Like there are some people who say that they're on the left who vote for the conservatives, but not very many. But also just the Greens and I put the NDP and the Greens on here as well. The NDP also has like quite a few people who call themselves like an 8 and still vote for the NDP. So the parties on the left really have to kind of be more heterogeneous. They have to reach to a broader set of people, and they do. And it's possible for the parties of the right, I think, to be more. I think the geography in a majoritarian system allows them to be more coherent and to have a narrower spread. And so just kind of see how this works in Metro Canada. So remember I showed you those graphs of Pennsylvania where the origin was City Hall in Pittsburgh. This one, City Hall in Toronto. And so we're just kind of moving out through Southern Ontario, and you see the same pattern. When you get to one of these old industrial cities in Southern Ontario, or a college town like Kingston, you get these stalactites where you have very strong left voting in the city center. So I've also been playing around. I'd like to update these with more recent elections, but if you do, I'm interested in this NDP Liberal divide. So as we go from the origin here being the City Hall in some city, this one's Winnipeg, because I wanted a city where it's the the NDP is the urban core party in Winnipeg. And the Liberals are still around. This is 2011, and that really matters. Of course, these change a lot from year to year. But the Conservatives, their line looks the same. It looks just like the U.S. The Republicans. It always looks just like Cleveland, Cincinnati, or whatever. But then you look at Vancouver, and this is another place where the NDP is really the metro area party. Like this is somebody else who has to explain to me why the Liberals can't be competitive in BC, and it's really the NDP. But then in Toronto, just to kind of highlight the nature of this problem, this coordination problem, you see in 2011 that the real city center party in Toronto is the NDP. They really get the highest support in the downtown, closest to the city center places in Toronto. But then in 2015, there's this kind of coordination problem gets solved differently, and then everybody's voting for the Liberals really throughout Metro Toronto. And again, you see the same shape to the relationship for the Conservatives. And so one of the things that I'm kind of fascinated by is, so in the U.S., the way this works out is that the Democrats really lose out in the transformation of votes to seats, and I think that's really clear. In Canada, it's just a lot more complicated because of this three-way, and then the Greens come along, and of course Quebec still don't understand exactly how it all works. Maybe over dinner somebody can finally get me to understand it. So it means that the transformation of votes to seats, it actually recently has favored the Liberals in part I mean, it's sort of, it's misleading in a sense, because the left, the combined left is dividing votes in funny ways, and people are coordinating on the left in funny ways, and so it shapes the nature of the transformation of votes to seats. This is just taking a measure of wasted votes. So just a wasted vote is a vote that you get in a riding that you win, but it's beyond what you needed to win, and it's a vote you got in a riding that you lost, and you add those together and you take them as shares of the votes that you receive, and you see that like the big loser in all this is the NDP. I mean, you already knew that, but you know, it's so in this kind of like this idea of urban parties sort of being hurt by this arrangement. It just has a different flavor in Canada, which is that the NDP that can never quite make it and can never form governments. And you end up with this party, with the Liberal Party, which is really a very centrist party that manages to really transform its votes into seats more efficiently. And the Conservatives really, do a little bit better than the other parties except for this moment when the Conservatives, of course, imploded and were factionalized for a decade and then came back together. But that's kind of what I think what that looks like. But the other thing I wanted to talk about, and I will stop here very soon, is this business of coordination failures. If you just think of a coordination failure as a district where the right was victorious, but the NDP and the Liberals combined had more votes, you could think about that. And then if you do it on the right, you take, are there districts where the right has a majority, but the left actually wins? That doesn't happen very often, but it did happen in that moment when the Conservatives fell apart and the Reform Party was battling in some of these places. That was really kind of temporary, but for the most part, really, this is something that happens on the left. The NDP Liberal coordination problem is real, and it does lead to some seats that end up going to Conservatives. So this is, as I was trying to say, this is an old problem, and it goes back to the industrial era. It goes back to the era when liberal parties were kind of the dominant party of the left, and then labor parties came along, and they started trying to compete in these urban districts where the liberals were already strong, and then they kind of do battle, and this is where some of the ideas that proportional representation is kind of a way out. This is where these ideas start to come from, and so you have labor-liberal splits in lots of places, and you kind of have this game of chicken where each party wants to be the mainstream party of the left, and so a lot of these parties, a lot of labor parties in their platform, like the biggest thing in their platform for a long time was proportional representation, which they equated to like real democracy. But then once they start to squeeze the liberals out and they become the mainstream party of the left, they start to change their mind about that, and that platform kind of gets lost. And then all of a sudden overnight it's the liberals in the UK that all of a sudden want PR, but it's too late. And they've had it. And to this day they're still trying to get PR. But you have I think because of this problem of the urban core of the Labour Party, the Jeremy Corbyn kind of part of the Labour Party, and then the suburban districts they have to win in order to be successful and form a government, the gap between them is so large that a lot of the progressives in the Labour Party have really embraced proportional representation now. So I just think there's something just distinctive about this long-term coexistence of the Liberals and the NDP in Canada. And I think part of it actually does have to do with Quebec and the fact that the Liberals are able to just kind of, in the US, if the moderate Democrats were to just have their own party and let the squad and the kind of the far left Democrats have their own party, it would be hard for that party to form majorities. But yet there's this kind of special thing that happens with the Liberals where they're able to do it. But maybe not forever. So we probably will not done talking about electoral reform in Canada. It seems like you all are always talking about it. But we are committed to ensuring that 2015 will be the last federal election conducted in the first past the post voting system. But so the same old story happened once again. The same thing with the liberal labor conflict going all the way back to the beginning. So I think that's kind of a fascinating story that continues. And so I promised Jacob that I would also say some things about federalism and decentralization. So I started with the idea that this is that a basic way of kind of solving the problem of geographically clustered preferences is to let people decide for themselves at the local level what they want to do. So I think for a lot of people in the U.S., you have some states like Pennsylvania is kind of one, but then even worse for progressives is a state like Texas, where they're getting closer to perhaps being a majority statewide, but there's a very strong urban-rural polarization. Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio vote overwhelmingly for the Democrats, but the suburban and rural voting bloc is still larger. And so they're very frustrated about their ability to try to get anything that they want in politics. And so we might think, solution here is just we need more federalism. So like everybody can be happy. Let's let Houston make its own decisions. And so we have this strange thing where I'm accustomed to a world in which conservatives like decentralization and people who like big government want this centralization. We're seeing the opposite now happening in the US, where there is a big fight over centralization, and it's the urban left in Texas that wants decentralization, and it is the ex-urban and rural right that really doesn't want to give it to them, and is in fact trying to get rid of whatever decentralization there is. They're trying to preempt local laws, prevent Austin from taxing, from increasing property taxes in order to do some local, to build some local infrastructure, even to do things like a bond issue for a new water treatment plant. The legislature is saying you can't do that. And so this is the kind of fight that is now increasingly being had in the US. And I kind of wonder, in Canada, it seems like some of the elements of this conflict are also here. I haven't heard, the municipalities in Canada are already kind of creatures of the provinces and don't have very much authority. But I wonder if this is an area in which, as these tensions grow in other countries as well, urban-rural conflict that's kind of being mediated in this kind of a system, if that is a battle that will continue to become more fierce in other places. That's where I wanted to stop, but I'm really looking forward to getting some questions and to having you tell me what I'm getting wrong about Canadian politics. Thanks.
At the RGCS Lecture Series, the first question is reserved to a member of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies Student Fellowship. Andrew.
Do these findings hold in Democratic primaries?
Meaning are there urban-rural?
Yeah, I think you've got you have a divide between, we want to call him center-left, but I guess in the States he's a Bolshevik, like Bernie on that side.
Yeah.
And everybody else on the other side. Do the same patterns hold?
Yes and no. There have been moments when they have. So there is some. I'm thinking back to the primary between Obama and Hillary Clinton when Obama won the nomination. It was incredibly divided. Like I remember I'm from Missouri, and Barack Obama won St. Louis County, St. Louis City, and Kansas City, and nothing else. And he barely beat Hillary Clinton, and all of the votes at the convention went to Obama. But when it comes to Bernie, he had with his platform toward trade and so forth, he had a very interesting rural support base, but also also good support in some cities. So one of the things I like, a counterfactual that I like to think about, is if Bernie had won the nomination when he came very close, I think it would have had a real impact on urban-rural polarization, because he had a set of connections that were not just urban, it's part because of his time in Vermont, but with his attitude toward trade and so forth, it's possible that would have actually reduced the urban-rural polarization. But in lots of primaries, we do still see it. You get candidates that are. A primary in a city, like an urban district, there's not really much interesting to talk about. But but like a statewide, like a gubernatorial primary, then yeah, absolutely, you get this kind of mobilization battle between the urban progressives and the kind of more moderate folks in rural places within the Democratic Party. Republican Party, I've got to think a bit more about how that, because there's just so little support in cities. I think it's really more of just a kind of a within rural and ex-urban battle in most cases.
Michelle.
Yeah, I was really interested by your slide, which showed kind of the ideological mean median. My inability to talk about graphs is going to become prevalent in this question, but and then kind of the distance that the more left has to traverse to get there. And I guess I was going to ask, A, what do you think are like strategies that could be used to kind of, like what would be the way to approach that? And then B, is not a question, but my own thoughts that I want to add, just being a rural Ontarian myself, I find that like something I'm really fascinated in is the, like this approach to it kind of condenses a lot of the beliefs, like the moral ones, and I'm constantly astounded by how convoluted the beliefs of people I grew up with can be. Like it doesn't map on very clearly to, often doesn't map on very clearly to this like classical left-right divide, just from my own very like personal subjective experience of just talking to people. And so I guess I would kind of ask if like messaging becomes very important in that regard, and kind of like focusing in more on the differences as opposed to the kind of amalgamations that combine. But anyways, that's just my thoughts, but I guess I wanted to know yours.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that like you shouldn't discount the value of trying to make sense of the conversations you have with people about politics in different places. I mean, so Kathy Kramer wrote a book that was based on exactly that kind of observation of how people are thinking about government in rural areas. And I spent a lot of time in the rural Midwest for family history reasons, and I think that, and so there's also survey research to back this up, is that people's preferences are just, they don't line up as nicely on a single dimension as political scientists would like to imagine that they do, so that we can make cool graphs like this. But the reality is that there are lots of people who are way off in the off diagonals, who will say with passion, that they think that that abortion is a deep, is a sin, and the most important thing to them is to abolish it. But at the same time, they might say that CEO pay is ridiculous, and we need to redistribute more, and we need better opportunities for rural schools need to be better, and more money needs to be spent on that. And people's preferences are all full of these kinds of the correlations can be very low across issues. And so that kind of leads into your first question is, well, what if you're the party of the left, then like what can you do? Well, one thing that the Democrats have always done, this is not new, the Democrats have always just been able to benefit from the incredibly decentralized, candidate-centric nature of American elections. So there was a time when you could just craft your own brand in a district in rural Michigan and not be sullied by whatever it was that the people out here were saying and doing, because no one really knew much about that. And now we're in the era of 24-hour partisan cable, where there is one network whose really their job, the thing that they mainly do, is interview these people and talk about them. So this is another project that's related to this, but if you look at which members of Congress are talked about on Fox News, or you look at the same thing on MSNBC, the people who get all the attention are over here. And really, it's just amazing that like AOC is the star of Fox News. She's mentioned more than anyone. And so the idea is to nationalize the politics, and this is a strategy that the Republican Party, I think, wisely adopted in the 90s, which is to say, make these people responsible for these people. And so part of the answer for the Democrats is like, can you kind of put the genie back in the bottle and like denationalize and localize the races? And so they try to do that, but it's getting harder and harder. And so the other thing you can try to do is actually get the party to kind of reputation to kind of be credibly more centered here, and that also seems very hard. And so some kind of a party breakup seems to be the other option, and it's one that some of the people out here would be perfectly happy with. That's kind of how I see it, but there's more to it. You can divide issue by issue and try to get try to message on the issues where you can do best here, and that's definitely something the Democrats try to do, but it's hard.
Shao.
So I have two questions, one short and one more substantive. The short question is, why Pennsylvania? Was your example for a long talk, and I'd be curious as to why you chose it. And the second is that it seems to me, or strikes me, that the assumption is that people are voting here. And I'm curious how you considered voter turnout throughout this discussion. And if people are not voting, perhaps at the state level, where are those people? Are they in rural areas? Are they in urban areas? And how does that then impact the results you get? And also, I'm curious more comparatively, Australia has mandatory voting.
Yep.
So you have a significantly higher turnout there than in Canada, or comparing Canada to the US voter turnout rates, either provincially or like within states or federally. Like, does it matter? Who are the voters, I suppose, is the broader question.
Yeah, that was a great question. I mean, the first one, Pennsylvania, it was a state. I wanted to kind of focus on a state that was really pretty evenly divided, and Pennsylvania's about it. You know, it's very, very 50-50 kind of state, but you know, one that kind of leaned Democratic, but where Republicans really had a lock on the legislature. It's also one I like I'm interested in the hierarchy of city sizes that you see. You have Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, but then you also have Allentown and all these other kind of smaller industrial towns, which kind of it creates some interesting variation as we move from the state legislature to the congressional level. It also, at the time I was writing the book, they were having a lot of fights about you know, court cases and stuff related to redistricting. So it was a case everybody was kind of talking about. So that was part of it. I mean, there's also, like, in the book, I do a lot. I weave kind of a story of some of the novels of Updike, which are all set in Pennsylvania through the kind of story of the history of the Democratic Party, and so that was another reason. But this question about voting, yeah, if I've got a graph kind of like those stalactite graphs where turnout is the variable that I'm looking at. And so this is kind of this is a kind of a fascinating thing about U.S. politics, but turnout is just incredibly low in city centers, and so a lot of it is poverty, and part of it might be challenges of election administration. You know, like keeping your registration updated in a place where people are constantly being evicted and moving from one apartment to another is really hard. But so turnout is incredibly low in urban places, and it's actually really shockingly high in rural places. So there is a big turnout gap, which you know, it doesn't really undermine this story. In some ways, it kind of strengthens it. And so that's also one of the things, though, that is this question about, well, what can and should the Democrats do when they have a statewide election, say like governor of Pennsylvania or the senator from Ohio. One of the things they're tempted by, and you can see why, is they have such low turnout in Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati. They said, well, if we could just push up turnout a little bit in those cities, we can win this statewide election. And so instead of trying to kind of get some moderates in the middle of the distribution, they're kind of trying to increase turnout over here. And the things that you do and say on the campaign trail that might facilitate that are not the same things that you would do and say over here, and they might even undermine your ability in the legislative races to win. So that turnout thing does really, I think, matter a lot, and I think there's more I'd still like to study about that, because that urban-rural divide in turnout is sort of uniquely American. In a lot of places, urban turnout is higher than rural turnout, and I can't quite remember. I did look at this for Canada, and it's somewhere on my hard drive, and I can't remember how the difference was, but it wasn't like the U.S. I think it was much more similar. But yeah, Australia, compulsory voting, I think it does a lot of nice things. It kind of, the whole messaging aspect of polarization, where you're trying to kind of turn out the base and send them all these messages about how nasty these people are. If everybody's voting, then that's a strategy that doesn't really make sense. So I'm kind of, that's something that I think might have good qualities, at least on this dimension.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, especially as someone from the state of Pennsylvania. It gave me a lot to think about. My question was just, I have a lot of questions in my head about the organizational story, and specifically the role organizations played in aligning the Republican Party with a rural voter base. I think your book gives a really compelling historical account of the role that labor unions played in establishing the Democratic Party as an urban party. But I was wondering what your opinion is on how the Republican Party used existing organizational frameworks in rural America to gain traction there. When we think of things like the Fraternal Order of the Police, churches, especially evangelical churches, gun clubs, and also, in turn, how we think this geographic divide has influenced or impacted the emergence of new organizations that have vast political importance in terms of mobilization, specifically with regards to the 2010 rise of the Tea Party and how that did so much for the Republican Party in terms of voter turnout, especially in rural areas.
Yeah, in a way, I feel like you're asking a question about something I was just talking about, which is the high turnout in rural places. Like that, it seems like there have to be organizations that are part of the story. Like somebody has to be mobilizing voters to make this happen. And so the easiest answer to your question is that it's a really good one. I don't think I don't have any great answers. I think that my intuition is that religious organizations are a really big part of the story, and that there's been some of them are like really on the ground, very local organizations, but it also just seems to me that that something has also changed in the media, in the communication technology environment, where so many, rural broadband does lag behind in some parts of the country, but lots of people do have access, and I think a lot of the mobilization efforts are happening, also through, not just through talking to people locally, but also through these. But I'm sure that the in-person, local, like church-based, organization-based outreach is more powerful, but like good research on the role of those organizations locally is nothing comes to mind as to what's been done to really show that, but it seems right to me that that's important.
No.
So I was just wondering about self-perceptions for ideological stances, if this might be kind of impacted by certain cultural issues within certain countries. For example, in the United States, it seems like there are a lot of people who, for instance, might be said to have far-right views, but they might not want to admit this because of the negative associations with saying that you're on the far right. And perhaps this might be the same with the far left. So is it possible that we might have these issues with trying to assess where people lie on the ideological spectrum based on unwillingness to admit where they actually are?
Yeah, that's always kind of a classic question, is like, and if that sort of thing varies from one country to another, especially when we're trying to do cross-country research, are there countries where everyone just sort of says they're a 5? And there seems to be something like that going on. But I will tell you, like, there are lots of people in surveys in the US who are perfectly happy to tell you that they are extremely conservative. The distribution, there are more of them on the right than on the left. But there are plenty of people in both parties who are happy to say that they're a 10 out of 10 or a 0 out of 10. But it also, I think that the one way to guard against that, I suppose, is to make these issue scales and ask people a lot of questions, and then take some kind of a factor analysis or some kind of average, and see where they are on a whole set of issues. But some kind of desirability bias and things like that. We know from lots of studies that exists, and that people don't really report their true preferences in some settings. So we have to kind of do the best we can to deal with those problems. But they are definitely they're definitely there, and they might be especially important cross country, I think.
Alex.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really wonderful. Just to bring us back to the Canadian case, I was really struck by the graph where we saw that Metropolitan Toronto NDP Liberal switch. And I'm just wondering if you've looked at, like, personal politics of the political leaders. Like, I know there was a huge NDP resurgence when I was a little kid about giving Jack a crack, who was a beloved NDP politician who, like, decimated the McGuinty-led Liberal majority. And the NDP actually became the left party. And then Jack passed away, and that switched back. And I'm wondering if in a circumstance where there's two left parties, and they're kind of Liberals, centrist party really, but they're kind of fighting for that more moderate vote, if it can cause a concentration of personal politics of the leaders themselves. Because that reversal was rather jarring. And I'm wondering if that could be, like, in your opinion, if it allows for more, oh, he seems like a good guy, I'm going to vote for him because I'm voting on the left anyways.
Yeah, it seems like it might create more room for personal politics, but it also might create more room for retrospective voting about what what a government has done. I mean, one of the things that I dislike very much about American-style polarization is that people might recognize that the party they support has done a very bad job with all sorts of things. But they say, but I mean, they did a horrible job. I couldn't be, like with COVID response, say, people might say, okay, I admit that this was horrible, but the pain, of voting, like of the other guy, letting these other guys, take over, is just so intense that I can't, really be voting retrospectively based on evaluations. So I think maybe something like that is sort of nice about having different flavors of the left to choose between. So if you don't like what somebody did, you could still vote for the left. It'd be better to have it on the right as well. It's one of the things that I think works out nicely in European proportional systems. But the personal politics thing, that's really interesting. I mean, that's just a kind of a nice hypothesis. I would have to try to take that to some data and see. But was the story you were telling about provincial politics, or was it so we're talking about federal politics? Yeah, because it seems like you do see at the provincial level. It seems like this sort of thing happens all the time, and you see these big switches that have to do with popular leaders. So there's just a bigger role for that sort of thing when there's multiple parties. That seems right to me.
I think your name is Robert.
Yes. So I had a question about what the role of the structure of the political institutions plays, and whether you can disaggregate that from the geographic question. So you mentioned in your introduction that your parliamentary system chapters have been condensed into one, and I'm wondering if that, because thinking about it, it seems to me that the UK, Australia, and Canada are actually very different. So the UK is not federated and effectively unicameral because the House of Lords is advisory. Canada is federated and still effectively unicameral, and then Australia is federated and genuinely bicameral. And then you have in the UK, parliamentary sovereignty before entry into the European Union, and presumably now post-Brexit, meant that there was no hard-edged judicial review of legislative action. Canada sort of has a bit of that, but we have the notwithstanding clauses and escape valve, and I think Australia does have hard-edged judicial review. So to what extent can you disaggregate the effects of the differences in institutional structure from the effects of the geographic distribution?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the reason for the parliamentary presidential divide is that I think that one really especially matters because the presidential system just kind of creates undisciplined political parties. It's credible to run in a district and say that if you're a Democrat, but if you get to DC, the first thing you will do is try to get rid of Nancy Pelosi. You can't really credibly do that. You can't run as a liberal and say, okay, I'm running against Trudeau. It just doesn't work given the vote of no confidence and so forth. So that was the big distinction. But these other distinctions absolutely matter. So I think I think the compulsory vote is another example of a kind of an institution. So I do wonder about Canadian federalism. Has to be part of the story for some of the things I've been talking about. Would the survival of the NDP and the Liberals in this kind of relationship, could that have worked out? Would that have worked out the same in a unitary system? I mean, it's just very strange if you just not thinking at all about federalism. You just think about the NDP hanging around, getting lots of votes but not very many seats, and then never forming governments. How is that sustainable? Well, at the provincial level, they're forming all these governments. And so even though I know the parties are very distinct, it does kind of sustain, it does affect federal politics. It has to. The fact that provincial politics seems to be bleeding into federal politics in the fate of the Liberals in British Columbia, for instance. So I think that the federalism dimension is very important. And so if we're trying to understand like the liberal-laborer divide in the UK, having it be a unitary system, I think really matters. This is different than in Canada. So, and so I think there's more work to be done on exactly how those things matter. This, to me, I'm an institutionalist. This is what I think drives the bus. And there's a lot about it that we still don't understand.
Just from the hand to the back, whose face I haven't seen. Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a two questions. The first one is, so you mentioned about you take the example of Pennsylvania, and you mentioned about Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and you also mentioned like the density and left voting, like theorem, or not theorem, but like the correlation with those of voting Idaho, but like in Pennsylvania, like the city like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, they have much more population than I presume the Idaho, and how does this like although they're both city centers are densely populated compared to suburban and rural areas, but how does this difference would create like another correlation in some sense, or for example, is there a linear correlation such as if there's 1 million people, the left voting would be increased much more compared to 300,000 people city? And the second question is, I mean, you say we can acknowledge as a fact about how this density and left voting correlates, but like in the progressive era, as some of your statistics present there, like 1916, I think, where there's heavy industrial worker present in city centers, which had kind of homogeneous voting like intention in the sense to the Republican or the Progressive Party at that time, and why didn't this density and left voting correlation didn't happen there, or did it? Thank you.
Yes, there's a couple questions. I'll maybe answer that second one first. That is one of the next research projects I'm trying to get a handle on. Is there's nothing about the urban-rural divide that actually is it doesn't have to happen. There are lots of settings where it doesn't happen, and in fact, it is. I've collected data now in Germany going back to the beginning of democracy. So during the Reich, and then during the Weimar period, and then since World War II, there were big spikes in urban-rural divide and voting behavior in Germany in the Reich and then the Weimar period. But then ever since World War II, it's been a slow decline in the urban-rural divide. So it is not something that just has to happen everywhere. There are places where it's gone. And where it never really emerged. And so I'm still trying to understand that. I do think there's just a clear thing that happened in the Industrial Revolution. But at the same time, I showed you those Canadian graphs, and in the industrial era in Canada, there wasn't really that big of an urban-rural divide. It didn't seem to emerge until more recently. So I still think there's a lot we don't understand about the conditions under which you will get an urban-rural divide. So it has to be constructed out of something. And it doesn't always happen. So so in that industrial area, a lot of the question was just what are the labor unions doing? In the U.S., they were still trying to align themselves with socialists until they switched to the Democrats during the New Deal. So it's a very contingent story, and it works out really differently in every place. The other question about I think as I understood the question is kind of well, there's a lot of heterogeneity. So you may say the correlation between density and democratic voting is there everywhere, but surely that correlation is different in different places. And what does that function look like? And is the disadvantage that creates for the left, is that the same everywhere? And I would say it's absolutely not the same everywhere. And this thing that I'm describing, it does not happen in all 50 states. In a place like Arizona, the geographic kind of penalty for the Democrats is not nearly, it's really, I think it's basically non-existent. And in a place like Florida, it has gone down over time because more people have moved from Puerto Rico to like sparsely populated parts of central Florida, and has made that place Democrats are less concentrated there. So there's all kinds of stories about how this changes over time, and there are arrangements in which the disadvantage for the left falls apart. So it's very contingent, and that's why, in part, why it's interesting, I think.
3 questions left. The person who was just behind, then Daniel Weinstock, then Will Robbins.
So thank you once again. Between the 60s and the 90s, a lot of people left cities, especially due to white flight. This is true for the US, but also for the UK and to some degree Canada. Meanwhile, the population of cities mainly grew due to migration from abroad. So the question is, what are the views of those who leave cities for more rural areas? Are they especially conservative? And secondly, how much of a role does migration away from cities play in this picture that you have just shown?
Yeah, that's something that I think about a lot, and the answer I think is I don't. it requires, and some of it requires data sets that we just don't have, like really good panel surveys of individuals where we follow them over time. We have better things than in other countries, maybe than the US. But I do think one thing we do know is that a lot of people who left in the era of white flight, I think there's pretty good evidence that many of them moved to suburbs of that same city that then became more conservative. So it was a move of people, who had preferences that were somewhat to the right of others in the city. So the city becomes more homogeneous, and that's part of the story, I think, in those graphs we're looking at, is that cities are becoming more homogeneous as some types of voters are moving out. And so that maybe takes the Democratic vote share from 60% to 80% or something like that. So I think that is part of the story. But nowadays, I think there's the movement of people away from, there's a lot of movement of educated people to like suburban areas in growing cities in the South, like Atlanta. And this is the whole story of how Georgia flipped. Lots of educated people and lots of minorities moved from other parts from the North to suburban Atlanta, and then that place has become more competitive, and the politics changed. So there's just an interesting graph that I don't have that I would love to show you of a change in population on the x-axis and change in Democratic vote share on the y-axis, and it's been really striking. The places that are gaining population are becoming more Democratic, and the places that are losing population are becoming more Republican. But the odd thing is, some of the places that are losing population and becoming more Republican are central core of Detroit and Cleveland. They're only becoming a little more Republican. But I mean, they're going from 85. I mean, but if you talk to people on the right, they're very excited about this. This is the beginning of the, going from 85 to 80% or something. But the rural places that are losing population are also becoming more Republican. So there's like sorting of people is definitely part of the story. I think Americans imagine that that's the entire story, and I think there's a lot more realignment going on than there is just people moving. But both things are powerful.
So. An assumption underwriting a lot of your talk is that the party structure is kind of constant. So in the United States, you have the Republicans and the Democrats, and basically that's a parameter rather than a variable. But of course, there are places, and this is one of them. But also think of France in the last 8 years, where you just make new where there seems to be no obstacle to making new parties. I mean, you said not to talk about Quebec, but this is a place where the party that is now dominant by an absurd sort of majority of seats didn't exist 15 years ago, roughly. The party that dominated the electoral landscape up until more or less the time that I was born is only present in the history books. So, do you have any sort of hypotheses about how it is that places, countries, jurisdictions that aren't all that different in terms of political culture, the kinds of values that people have, some seem able to just make up new parties almost at will, whereas places like the United States, arguably federal Canada, are kind of stuck with these parties that are imperfect reflections of what's actually the preference distribution on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest answer is like proportional representation helps new parties, of course, but we're talking about within majoritarian variation. And so I think part of the reason why the United States just is stuck with the same two parties, in part is because the parties are so meaningless and so heterogeneous, and it's not really clear there is much point. You can just say whatever you want and put a D next to your name and win a primary and call yourself Democrat, because there's no party, there's no vote of no confidence procedure and so forth. So I think that's why it's harder to see entry in the U.S. context. But as for why, what explains kind of the entry and the coming and going of parties in parliamentary systems, that's harder. I mean, we have the UK Independence Party that seemed to be really, making progress, and then, often someone steals their thunder, and then they kind of go back down again. But I think geography plays a big role in this process. I mean, I think that's just something I'd like to understand better. Is that when you have a system of winner-take-all districts, entry is something that I do know a lot about the history of entry of parties in the early 20th century. And back then, Europe also used winner-take-all districts. And it was, the labor parties initially entered in a handful of districts where there were a lot of workers. And then they eventually kind of expanded. So geography and the concentration of groups is a very big part of the story of party entry. But it's one that I think there's still lots to understand in a lot of other places.
We're at time, and I've got.
My question was fairly much asked
Okay.
already.
Then I'm going to do a little bit of concluding business before I ask everyone to join us in a reception in the adjoining ballroom. The concluding business includes saying to people who are coming to the dinner, can I ask you to hold that for me?
Oh, okay.
People who are coming to dinner, please assemble outside the double doors at 6:45. The Research Group on Cultural Studies Lecture Series will resume January 26th in this room with a talk by Asha Rangappa from Yale University Law and Public Policy. And later in the winter semester, we should still be joined by Daniel Zablat, who, like Jonathan Rodden and Sharon Krause, has been on the COVID postponed lecture list. And then we will conclude the winter semester with David Schmidt's Philosophy Arizona in April. RGCS is a unit of the Jan P. Lin Centre for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. And we thank the Lin Centre for its support of RGCS, and we thank a generous grant from the Institute for Liberal Studies for particular support of the lecture series. We're now going to give away a copy of Why Cities Lose.
Is this a tradition of the?
This is a tradition.
All right.
Yes, we give away Why Cities Lose every time.
No, right. Funny, Jacob.
50. Sasha. Is Sasha here? Sasha.
Does the author then hand the book
Yes.
to the?
Yes.
Right.
And with that, we conclude today's session. Please join me in very warmly thanking Professor Jonathan Rodden.